Hi, everyone. Welcome to Project Herpetoculture podcast. I'm your host, Roy Arthur Blodgett, and I'm joined as always by my intrepid co-host, Philip Leitz of Arids Only. We have an excellent show for you today, but before diving in, we'd have some brief housekeeping. So first, I'd like to thank Dylan and the Animals at Home Network for hosting our show. It continues to be a pleasure being part of this platform. We'd also like to extend special gratitude to Charlie, who generously edits our audio and has done a lot to improve the quality of our show over time. And we'd also like to take a moment to tell you about our sponsors. So first, we have Custom Reptile Habitats, who have been with us since day one. They produce top-of-the-line PVC reptile enclosures, and I use them for a lot of the large format Vivaria here. They're also carrying universal rocks, misking products, and a bunch of other useful stuff. So if you're in the market for any of that and you're planning to make a purchase, consider doing so through the link in our bio or description. We'll receive a small commission at no additional cost to you, and that really helps us keep the lights on over here.
Up next, we have Fairy Tale Dragons. That's a joint venture between Heather Moy and Ron St. Pierre, both of whom have achieved legendary status in herpetoculture. They've accomplished quite a lot and produced some of the finest bearded dragons and taliqua in the country, alongside a whole host of other species such as emerald tree boas and green tree pythons. Check them out if you're in the market for any of that, and be sure to follow along with them on social media. They're always up to something interesting over there.
Next, we have Cold-Blooded Caffeine, roasters of delicious coffees from all over the globe. We have a private label with them, the PH Blend, which is a light roast coffee from Rwanda. It's a great choice for those who prefer a more floral coffee with notes of berry, but they have a wide variety of options for a broad array of preferences. So check them out. And if you place an order, don't forget to use the code PROJECTHERP for 10% off.
We're also very pleased to have the support of Exoterra, a brand that needs no introduction. It's safe to say that herpetoculture wouldn't be where it is today without the influence of Exoterra. For decades, they've been industry leaders in innovation, offering just about everything needed for reptile care, from diets and supplements to enclosures, substrates, and lighting. We're both big fans of their naturalistic terraria and substrates in particular. They have a lot of interesting products in the works as we speak, and we're really looking forward to seeing what comes next.
And next we have Tamura Designs. For those in the know, Tamura Designs is widely regarded as one of the finest enclosure manufacturers on the planet. They produce outstanding large format Vivaria with endless options for customization, drains, UV printed backgrounds, lighting rigs. On top of all of that, they also make amazing deli cup displays for expos and these incredible multi-unit condos, which I use here. So if you're interested in any of that and you decide to make a purchase, use the code Herpetoculture for 15% off one item as a special offer to our listeners only. We also have Happy Dragons. We're really thankful to have the support of Happy Dragons. They are producing some amazing content for bettering our reptile care. And we've been actually partnering with them to produce even more content like webinars. Also, the platform and subscription service offers breeder access to first clutches, things like that. We have online courses coming down the pipeline. In addition, we have live Q&As with reptile experts, such as Mariah Healy from Reptifiles. It's truly an outstanding subscription package that also offers discounts on their supply partners, such as Ovipost and Joss's Frogs. It's really an outstanding product. So check it out and let us know what you think.
And last but not least, if you're interested in supporting the show directly with something of a tip or a monthly donation, check out our Patreon page at patreon.com/projectherpetoculture. We have a monthly live chat there with all of our paid subscribers. That's been a whole lot of fun so far. We also have a whole line of merchandise like t-shirts, mugs, pint glasses, and more on our website. And of course, sharing the show with a friend, subscribing on YouTube, and keeping up with social media is always very helpful.
And with all that said, we're on to the show. Thanks, everybody.
Ask you. Sure, it's going to ask you to like confirm that that's cool. Okay. All right. So awesome. Project Herpetoculture. I don't remember the episode. It's like 80 something. Today, Roy will be conspicuously absent. He and I occasionally have to do a show on our own because of either some various scheduling conflicts or whatnot. And so this is one of those situations. But Really stoked because my guest is Brandon from Rare Earth. Brandon, it's Shiflett. Is that your last name? Is that correct?
Shiflett, you got it.
Okay, awesome, sweet. So I'd really like to just kind of dive in here, and the first thing I want to ask you, man, is how did herpetoculture start for you? Like, was it something was there like one kind of big event where you're like, oh, reptiles and amphibians, or is it something you've been doing forever, something you've been interested in since you were a kid?
Yeah, it's definitely been a forever deal on my end. I grew up, well, I was born in Michigan, and I remember catching snapping turtles and little paintids and garters when I was, before memories even kind of start there, probably 2, 3, 4, 5 years old. But then grew up in Western Pennsylvania, and amphibians, as far as newts and salamanders, is phenomenal there. And we were a big camping family and grew up four-wheeling and dirt bikes. And so the dirt bike and four-wheeling downtime in Western Pennsylvania, there's just herping opportunity left, right, and center. And so when we weren't cruising around causing trouble on the dirt bikes, it was definitely out looking for things. And, those were some of the first captives were anything I could get a hold of that I knew what to feed. That was the rule of my dad was, well, if you don't know what to feed it, you can't keep it. And then my mom's initial rule was no snakes. But when I started sneaking snakes in and keeping in boxes in the closet and things like that, finally she said, all right, snakes are allowed as well, but let's keep them in proper enclosures. So to answer your question, I mean, I was keeping things in preschool and kindergarten, and I guess as far as the first thing that did not come out of the wild, or at least came from a pet store, was a tokay gecko. And,
cool.
And that was actually, and that was kind of a funny story. It was go to the pet store looking for something because I got the green light to actually buy a lizard. And, not surprising with a wild caught tokay, the pet store owner grabs the tokay. He doesn't get it right behind its neck. It turns latches on his hand. And it seems like it's latched on there for an hour, but 5 or 10 minutes go by as he's still trying to sell me this tokay. And my mom's whispering, "Are you sure you want this lizard?" And yes, I definitely wanted this big, nasty lizard. And so tokay gecko was the first lizard I ever bought from a pet store, and was the first lizard I ever bred as well. So I guess the tokay gecko, I guess, is where it started. But even in first, second, third grade, I was trying to set up things to breed. And, sometimes I would have 2 different curly tail species, thinking that this giant one species was going to breed with this other species, that it's never going to happen. And I probably didn't even know if it was male and female, but even in elementary school was trying to already get involved in herpetoculture. And so it kind of grew from there.
And so that's really interesting. So the breeding part of it, the breeding aspect of it was like a part of your thinking around it, was a part of the appeal early on?
Yeah, I think enjoying the life cycle. I mean, I talked to, that's one of the first things I ask my customers. It's not, do you want to breed these to make money, but are you looking to enjoy the full life cycle? And it's basically, should we be looking for a potential single male for you, or, are we looking for multiples because you're wanting to enjoy the full life cycle? And I think maybe it stemmed from, you would find a painted turtle nest or a snapping turtle nest that had hatched on the side of a pond, and seeing those eggs and being interested in potentially seeing that in a home setting is where that started. But breeding the tokays after keeping them for a number of years was definitely of interest to because I'm buying subadults and adults. So the thought of a tiny little tokay coming out of these little gecko eggs was certainly of interest.
Yeah, absolutely. So randomly, about how old were you when you bred those tokays? Were you pretty young?
It was middle school. Oh. I think when I got my first, eggs from them. And I I'm trying to think how nasty male tokays would be to each other. I guess they probably would be ugly with each other, but I probably just got lucky with matching them up, and really I didn't have any ugly situations with those guys. But the first tokay I got, he lived until I was a senior in high school. So I don't know the life expectancy these days with the amount of captive tokays are out there. So I mean, do you know, is it 15, 20 years on those guys?
I have no clue.
Okay. Well, so as a kindergartner, I got what was already an adult, and it turned to be an adult female, and she passed when I was a senior in high school. So, you know, decent first captive as far as a pet, that's for sure. Yeah. And so the tokay led into, I did do a lot of community tanks, and I did have an attraction for more natural setups. So, I mean, some of the animals I was keeping together probably was not super appropriate at this point when you got I think the first community tank I set up was a 30-gallon, and it had a water section with a real nice waterfall in there with a canister filter, with the hose coming up to the top of it. And obviously I've got a dad supporting my hobby, or I wouldn't have been able to pull this off on my own. Sure. But a nice water feature, and then 2 panes of glass. So there was a little wet section, and then there was a dry section with actual live plants growing in there. And, it was overstocked for sure, but there was some arboreal species. There's a day gecko in there, and then an Asian painted frog in there, I remember. And then, a turtle, a small turtle, in a too small of a water area, but some neat community tanks in I guess late elementary and middle school.
Wow, that's really, really cool. I had a weird experience when I was in, I think it was also probably middle school. I say weird experience, but it was more of like a formative one. I went over to a friend's place. I think I've told this story before on the show, because it was all around that middle school era when things got really, really interesting for me in herpetoculture. That's when I went to a friend's house and I saw he was breeding bearded dragons. And I didn't even know that it wasn't even about the bearded dragons. It was about I had no idea that people propagated animals in captivity at all. Like, I knew it happened at zoos, and I knew zoos worked on it, but I did not know that private hobbyists could do that with animals at all. It just never registered with me for some reason. And then I went to another friend's house. His name was Aaron Bauer or something. In his bedroom, he had a 40-gallon tank that was a live vivarium with like a false bottom, and he had anoles and long-tail grass lizards in there. And I remember because he had plants that were growing right up to the screen, and I was asking him questions about it, and he mentioned like, oh yeah, they lay eggs in the dirt all the time. It's really cool. And I was like, what? Like that as an option never crossed my mind until seemed like it was all kind of condensed in this 1 year at middle school.
Yeah. Yeah.
That could just be a little bit of like my memory and like quirks of memory. Cause I'm you never really know, sometimes you get older, you never know exactly how things start.
Well, you're sparking some memories in myself. I mean, at 10 years old, and I don't even know how my parents got connected with this breeder, but there was a breeder, and he was certainly a very interesting fellow, like many of us reptile people are, I guess. But this is in Pittsburgh. And I mean, he had cobras, he was breeding basilisks, he was breeding, like, I remember seeing my first Brazilian rainbow boas. And actually, as I say this, now I remember what the connection was. I was looking for a corn snake, and this guy bred corn snakes. And so I remember going, and I think the corn snake shed for the very first time, in my hand, and seeing this guy's collection. And he was a legitimate, very serious breeder. Yeah. And I actually took 1 or 2 weekend trips with him, and my parents toting along as well, because I was 10, to the All Ohio Reptile Show. And so I don't know if that show's still going on, but back in the day, I mean, this would be, I think, 37 years ago, but back in the day, that was a super nice show. Yeah. And there was some top-notch stuff there. I remember some Aussie frill dragons, with some bright, orangish colors on them. I don't really I don't know. I guess beardeds would have been around. I don't remember seeing them there, but I remember I got a Chilean dwarf tegu. I don't know if you know what those guys look like, but yeah. So they're and this is when you go blind into a show, and you should fully research. And when people take years before they touch base with me, I love it. And they fully have researched all of their stuff. But this is, you show up blind to a show with cash in your pocket, and what are you going to bring home? And these Chilean dwarf tegus, and clearly all wild caught, they're all at cool room temperature. So they're all super relaxed, and the vendors, kind of showing me how tame they are. They're just laying in your hand. Right. Well, this big male, because I got the biggest head and the biggest jowl Chilean dwarf tegu, and that's really about the size of like a adult tokay gecko. So it's a very small tegu, but still a formidable little lizard. And when you got that thing at operating temperatures, it's a kind of a nasty animal, and it wants to bite you, and it's serious dentition on it and jaw strength on it. I won't jump too far into those stories, but I will say we did have in this house that we lived in. We moved to Indiana, and I had what we called the ring of death. And the ring of death was I'll tell it. I guess we're into it now.
Yeah, let it go.
Me and these new buddies that I'm trying to impress at 14. Lay out a sheet, sit in this empty room, let the tegu loose, and a little hopper in there, and where it goes from there. So the ring of death wasn't so great for the little hopper, but it was exciting, and my buddies loved it when the new crazy reptile guy moved into town.
Right. Yeah, man. I definitely have an embarrassingly long list of crazy, ridiculous memories. I worked at the first reptile shop in Colorado. Was called Reptilian Haven, and it was owned by this guy named Randy Kawamoto, and he passed a few years ago. So this little bit of a long time ago, and I was like 16. So this was 20 years ago, 21 years ago. And, man, the stuff I saw in that shop, like it's both not okay and great, a mix of everything. But boy, you said it best early that the reptile people they can be interesting people. And so it's it's really funny to think back on some of those weird memories.
Well, in that All Ohio Reptile Show, 37 years ago, the stuff that people would pull out from underneath those tables, today, they'd be in jail probably, but there was definitely some wild stuff. As a 10-year-old, I was shocked and loved seeing, for sure.
Do you think, excuse me. Yeah. So that's actually kind of an interesting topic, and one that comes up a lot for me, just when I'm thinking about herpetoculture as a whole. It's like, thinking about how is it a good or a bad thing, or is it a mix that we can't really like, that herpetoculture isn't quite what it used to be in terms of like that Wild West element to it. I feel like it's still like a super young industry, and it's probably still a very, very long way to go before we get to a point of like, I don't know, cultural stability. If that's a fair way of putting it, but so many of us look so fondly back on those days when you could just pop into some show and find something really, really wild and cool, and, maybe not legal, probably not legal, lots of huge question marks and things. Do you have any kind of leaning on that? Do you feel like it's maybe better that it's not that way anymore? Do you miss it a little bit? How do you feel?
Oh, I'm sure plenty of guys will hate that I say it, but I think maybe because I was kind of a bad little kid at times and getting into trouble, I'm more of a rule follower now. And so I just think that in general, the reptile community, as far as like the normal population, we're already kind of the weirdos. And so we don't need more black marks or black eyes by, some of the activity we have. So the closer to following the letter of the law, I enjoy that, more, I guess. I appreciate some of the species that people have brought in and I don't want to say take risks on, but it creates energy, when there's new species around, or people stick with species that are difficult to work with and figure them out. So I appreciate all those, and I wouldn't want it to be an only leopard gecko, crested gecko, and ball python world. So I don't want to be a hypocrite on that front either, but I do think there are some animals that just don't make good pets, and we shouldn't be breeding thousands of. And I won't alienate myself by saying the species, but there's, to me, I guess my mindset has been, because I've worked in zoos, that I loved working with some of the venomous that I did, and I think they're very interesting. And I'm not saying that venomous shouldn't be in private hands, but I don't think venomous should be mainstream. Some of the large stuff that's very dangerous, there's only so many of those that we need, because I just think we need to be able to properly care for these. For myself, I've stuck with the dwarf monitors. I recognize that they've got high metabolism, they're active animals, but even like the mid-size to the large stuff, I struggle to produce those, because I say, well, what kind of homes am I going to properly get these even mid-sized monitors to? I mean, I've had the sand monitors, or Varanus gouldi flavirufus, and even those, I had 3 of them in an 8x6x5, and I felt like they were comfortable in there. I think it would have been better to just have a pair in there. But even having those, I said, man, if I really got these rolling, how many people are properly going to be caring for these in the US? And because I'd been in the monitor world long enough, I was like, it's a handful. And I think it's important that people do work with those. It would just bug me if tons and tons of that size and larger continue to get produced, because I know there's just not the enough keepers to properly care for them. Flavirufus don't belong in a 6-foot cattle trough, or even an 8-foot cattle trough, in my opinion.
Man, I am right there with you. I donated my Egyptian Uromastyx pair to Ty Park down in Florida, and part of why I did that is because he was going to give him a larger cage than I ever could, much larger. And I couldn't, in good conscience, produce that species anymore. The Egyptian Uromastyx, they're huge. I mean, it even if you take away the spatial concerns, like the recognition that thing needs a lot of space, like a ton of space to get proper exercise, just thinking about the limiting factor of how do you light an animal that large? It's hard enough to get like a great basking zone on something as medium-sized as a bearded dragon or an ornate Uromastyx. Like, you have to have such a wide beam. It can't just be one little bulb. It has to be such a wide piece of real estate. And for an Egyptian Uromastyx, you'd need half a dozen lights or more, all focusing into one space for that thing to really, really kick up and metabolize as it really needs to, and like hit peak temperature and thermoregulate in the ways that they get the opportunity to do so in the wild. It's really hard to do. So I just couldn't keep producing them. It just became
what's the average? What's a clutch size for those?
Oh man, they would. So I don't know what the average is, but by the time I stopped working with them, the female was laying high 20s regularly. So 26.
Yeah, I was going to guess like 40 or something.
Yeah, and it might go up that high given a little bit of time. I only produced them for like 5 years or so, and I would. And when she first bred, she only laid like 18 or something, but it was, or maybe it was 14, but regardless, it was only going to go up from there, and obviously she would have hit a peak and said, like, all right, this is how many eggs I produce. And maybe she would have started skipping seasons, but regardless, it was the kind of thing where it just didn't, I've probably produced about 70 of those things. And I can count on one hand the number that I know to this day that I can reliably tell you they live here with this person in this good setup, and they're living this kind of life. And that's an animal that lives, I'm betting money they live as long as as a cyclura. So they could probably live 30 to 60 years. I have no doubt in my mind. So it just became this thing where I'm like, I can't do this anymore. And then conversely, it's also why I started focusing on a couple of other projects with smaller stuff. For example, Xenogama taylori, adults that big, and they're great. They're not like a fragile. They're not like a, sometimes the smaller you get with a lizard, the more like fragile they can sometimes appear, or like less apt to be something that you could handle or interact with, because either they're too fast or maybe they're maybe just a little bit, delicate. And the Xenogama is not like that. They're pretty strong and bulldogged, and so they have the ability to provide those animals with a very high baseline standard of care. I mean, to me, it makes them an absolutely perfect candidate for herpetoculture. I mean, they're perfect in that way. So I have a strong like emotional tie to that kind of stance where, you make a choice that, I really want to try to combine as much, insert as many ethics as I can into what I do here, because I mean, we're dealing with living animals, right? And so okay. So still curious. I'd like to backtrack just a little bit to the beginning.
I was thinking, man, I jumped over like 20 as you were talking about some stories. I was like, man, that was a funny story from 7th grade, and that was a funny story from 10th grade as well. But I guess just to wrap up on what you were saying just then.
Oh yeah, please.
I mean, I super appreciate all of these people that are working with the chelonians and these large varanids and these other species.
Right.
I just personally would really struggle with it, like you're saying. I mean, to me, the stuff I work with is pretty sturdy, and they don't have, they have longer, lifespans than a lot of reptiles, but it's not 50, it's not 60, it's not 70 years. And so it's more of a commitment to me when I'm talking to people that aren't very educated, that haven't done the research already. To me, it's more of a commitment to a dog, a commitment as far as like lifespan expectancy, where it's not, it's not a sulcata tortoise type commitment. So
right. It might be a multiple lifetime commitment, it's like,
so I appreciate what everyone else is doing, but I'm just not quite comfortable with that myself.
Oh no, same. I mean, I feel very, very similarly about, the production of things like, leopard geckos or crested geckos. It's like, it's the same kind of thing. Those are 30 plus year lifespan geckos, and they're very productive, and they may not be very big, but that's a long lifespan. That's a long lived little critter. And so I have the same kind of concerns that are very much coupled with an admiration for people who are doing that work, because I feel that way, as you mentioned, the chelonians, and, for me, like reticulated and Burmese pythons come to mind for me, croc monitors, savanna monitors, black-throat monitors, any of those huge, or even, as you mentioned, the Varanus gouldi, the Flavorufus, and those guys, even those things, I mean, they're massive. They can get huge. And I mean, frankly, monitors up past a certain size, they can just be dangerous. They can just be straight up dangerous if they're not understood and given proper respect and space and the things that they need. I mean, they can be a real formidable thing. Same thing with a rhinoceros iguana, really, really formidable animal, so that, in the same way that we, you mentioned dogs, I feel the same way about a lot of these reptiles. It's like, yeah, man, like some people need a golden retriever or a chocolate lab, and some people, a smaller number, but some people also need a Belgian Malinois that is trained to be a police dog. You know what I'm saying? Like,
well, yeah, but I think it's like the same amount of people need a Malinois that need a croc monitor. It's a very, very select few, and it's like, you better not have a real job, and you might. I hope you're running 15 miles a day and biking 20 miles a day and ready to throw you get it. If you're not going to work a dog like that, it just doesn't make sense.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And so it's it's extremely interesting to think about. So what I wanted to pop back to is the was there a point for you, was it a very clear or well-defined point when herpetoculture went from being something that you did as enjoyment for yourself and when it turned into something that's more of a career? Because I know, I know you worked for some zoos, as you mentioned, and I know, I don't know exactly how your careers in conjunction with herpetoculture have gone throughout your life. I don't know if that's still, sort of the main thing for you. If you have something else now, I know there have been times where you've had herpetoculture scaled up a little bit more. So I hope that question makes sense.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, I guess the kind of like timeline of events was in high school, super into sports, big time into soccer, big time into wrestling. Definitely had a decent reptile collection, nidinoles, the geckos, some snakes as well. And then downsize, I did go to Purdue, and I went to Purdue initially for pre-vet, but it was more of, I didn't know what the degree was going to be, veterinarian obviously associated with animals, but went to Purdue, and honestly, academics was the third priority after playing soccer and socializing. And then it was academics. And so very quickly recognized that being a veterinarian was not where I wanted to be semester one. So I went to school for wildlife science, which it sounds good as far as, herpetoculture, but it really was for people that wanted to work for DNR. So it was people that wanted to, work at national parks or use it as an undergraduate degree for something else. I mean, it was literally one herpetology course, which was pretty funny because as far as like native stuff, my professor was great. But as far as captive stuff, I knew 10 times more than this guy. And he was a great guy. But I remember it was funny because I was working in zoos at the time. I worked at a small local zoo in high school and then for 2 college summers. And because it was a smaller zoo, there really wasn't a lot of specialists. And so at 18 and 19, I did know more than, not trying to pat myself on the back here, but knew more about reptiles than anybody else there. And so I had a ton of leeway, and it was kind of it was AZA accredited zoo, but operated very old school underneath the zoo director at times, which kind of had some safety issues looking back at it. But as far as like a 17, 18, 19, 20-year-old, it was phenomenal because I was, I'm getting on alligators, there's a lot of macho type, interaction with these animals. And, the second summer I was there was nobody that was capable of working with this venomous stuff. The gal that was in charge, it's not that it was because it was a female, but it was because her background was more in cats and in livestock. And she took this position just because it was a lead keeper role. But the point is, I'm at, I think I was 18 and I'm doing mite treatments on a cottonmouth, on a 4-foot cottonmouth that I know the big joke is cottonmouths, they don't chase you. But in this cube that this cottonmouth was in, it had 2 locks on it and then a twist metal knob on it. They take the locks off, and I'd always wear, they weren't like snake boots, but they were just like rubber, like the rubber boots. And then I'd use a 4-foot snake hook, and I'd keep that door shut, knowing that as soon as I opened that door to that cottonmouth exhibit, she's springing out at me because she was just super defensive. And so she'd spring out and she'd be spazzing out on the ground. But, as an 18-year-old with pretty limited venomous experience, I'm trying to pin this cottonmouth's head down with not even, I don't know the name of the tool that has like the kind of the firmer rubber band in it that's more appropriate. But I'm just using a 4-foot snake hook to gently push, firm enough to hold this 4-foot cottonmouth's head down, but not so hard that I break this thing's neck. And I'm holding this cottonmouth by hand as its fangs are working independently, dripping venom off of its fangs. A quarter to a half an inch away from my fingers. And I remember the vet and the vet, and I had as I'm messing with, and I got her into a 55 gallon, trash container. And I remember as I'm doing this, I got like an audience, and I just had at 18, I had to kick everybody out of this hot snake room. I'm like, guys, I'm too nervous here. I had to kick them out until I had this thing in hand. And so when I have it in hand, the vet and the vet tech come back in, and we're doing this mite treatment. And I just remember watching those fangs just going, and she's so agitated. And finally, I'm like, you guys got to be done. My thumb's starting to cramp here, And so great experience, but some kind of crazy stuff when you're working with some, and I say crocodilians, alligators, so not the most aggressive of the crocodilians out there, but 10-foot alligator and some smaller Siamese. But I mean, because I was a reptile nut and I hung out with the veterinarian who was the assistant zoo director at the zoo as well, I get him all hyped up on these AZA surplus lists. And so we had more animals off exhibit than we did on exhibit, because he's just getting in all these free AZA surplus animals. But we had try not to tell fish stories. I'm trying to think of the size of this not cottonmouth, gaboon viper. But I feel like it was approaching 5 feet, and the girth on a maybe it was 4 feet, but I thought it was 5 feet, the girth on it, like you're showing, was the size of about the size of a thigh on this animal. So great experience, but pretty wild.
Yeah, man. Yeah, that's a trip. We had at that same Reptilian Haven shop, the owner had a venomoid albino Western Diamondback. And that thing, holy smokes, man. I don't know if it was watching some of the guys occasionally have to move that snake from one enclosure to another, or whatever it was. I never had interest in keeping anything venomous or touching anything venomous. I mean, I've been bitten by the Uromastics. It's like the slowest lizard, they're not fast. If I get bit by that, I'm going to get bit by a venomous snake for sure,
Well, that's so strong jaws on a Euro though. Yeah. And I think I was the same way. I won't say heavy interest, but my interest in venomous got stifled a little bit as far as keeping them on the home front after working with enough venomous in a zoo setting, being around. I worked with a spitting cobra, but it was a venomoid one as well. But it's still, and I swear it made a noise when it would strike at you. It seemed like it was going, every time it strike, and you're wearing a mask for safety and an apron as well. But even every time it did it, it got you sweating every time you dealt with it, and some large Mojave rattlesnakes. And so after dealing with some of the more, and I don't know if you've dealt with Mojaves, but they were horrible on a snake. Yeah, a lot of rattlesnakes, easy on snake hooks once you have them off the ground, at least the ones that I've dealt with. But the Mojaves, they were always flipping and flopping on the ground, and not quite as traditional as some of them. But I'll try to get through the timeline here, and then we can get on more of our tangents. So I worked at Potawatomi Park Zoo, was the small zoo in northern Indiana that I worked at, and then I did an internship at Columbus Zoo in Ohio, which was, they didn't really have true zookeeper positions as far as summer jobs, so it was interpretive work. So that I was working in the aquarium, so they've got like 100,000 gallon aquarium. And so you're telling the public, you're giving a presentation about all the animals that are in that 100,000 gallon aquarium. They had a little touch pool where the kids could come up with 2 fingers and touch the starfish and some of the other animals. And then they had a little, touch a shark tank that they did. But before the zoo opened, did get to work in the reptile building some, which it was great. That was the first time I was around any true like specialist. This Columbus Zoo was big enough and had enough animals. They had a turtle gal who she knew her turtles. They had a snake guy that was incredible with their snakes. They had a lizard guy, and so there was some true specialists at the Columbus Zoo. And it was neat that Jack Hanna worked there as well. So growing up, I was, the ego, and I was, I wrestle, alligators. And if I go to Florida, I'm going to catch an alligator. Jack Hanna, he's just this TV personality and he's too goofy. You know, I'm not concerned about him. But I was in the snake room, and I go to open the door to come out of the snake room, and Jack Hanna opens it from the other side with his family. And I was definitely starstruck by Jack Hanna, and he was an absolute great guy and introduced me to his family. And so it was a neat experience to meet Jack and his family, and working at the zoo was great. So there wasn't a ton of hands-on, but they did have an amazing collection, and there was some great keepers there with decades and decades of experience. So it was the first time that I'd been around that kind of experience for sure. And so moving on, after I graduated from Purdue, to rewind, in a zoo setting, at the first zoo that I worked at, I was working with reptiles, but I also worked with all the primate species. And so my goals at that time were really to work with primates. And even though it was a small zoo, I think they had 10 primate species, including chimpanzees. And so some neat primate species. And so my goal after I graduated was definitely to work in zoos and move around the country in zoos, but ultimately try to get zoo funding to go study primates in the wild. And so after graduation, that's why I ended up at Utah's Hogle Zoo in Salt Lake City, Utah, because I think at the time, and it's a small zoo too, I think it might only be 40 acres, but I think they had 20 species of primates. So a very nice primate collection with gorillas and orangutans, and then, a lot of different species all the way down to the small tamarins and marmosets. And they had so many primates that their primates were divided up into 3 different primate sections. So there were days of working in a small animal building where you're doing primarily reptiles, but they would have some primates mixed in. And then they had a primate zone, they had primate forest, and then they had apes as well. So I guess it was technically 4 areas with primates. And so working with primates was the ultimate goal. So have some reptiles at home, but work in a zoo setting with the primates. Wow. And so at that time, working at Utah's Hogle Zoo, I did have bearded dragons, and I did have Brazilian rainbow boas. And I guess to back up, in college, breeding bearded dragons, like bearded dragons kind of came onto the scene more at shows when I was in college. And I just had, normal phase bearded dragons were hot sellers and kind of not super special animals, but there was, everything wasn't morphed out at that time. It was kind of right at the front end of the morphs. And so I had a running ad in the Purdue newspaper a lot of the time where I was selling bearded dragons. And so for a college student, $50 a bearded dragon. And, bearded dragon was a really cool lizard for, guys and girls to have, in college. So sold those. And then the Indianapolis Reptile Show was once a month. And so what I didn't sell in the Purdue Exponent is what the newspaper was called. I'd sometimes set up at the Indianapolis Reptile Show to sell bearded dragons, and then sell sometimes Brazilian rainbow boas as well. And then, moved out to Utah to work at the zoo there. But then I became a dad and decided that moving back to Indiana to become a father, I didn't want to make $19,500 a year. So I decided, I had a second job as well. Most zookeepers, if you didn't have a rich, significant other, you were working at the zoo, and then you'd go home and eat a meal and then go to your second job that you were probably making a higher hourly rate than you were working at the zoo. So I love zookeepers or anybody in the zoo setting, and definitely have friends that are in the zoo field, but it's the ultimate respect because you have to have passion for the animals, and you have to love the animals. You're never working in a zoo to get rich. So it's anyone that's still working in zoos or has a career in zoos, they're great people. But moving back to tiny town Indiana, I did not want to work at that small zoo for basically the rest of my life, or at least while I was raising my son over the next couple decades. So I did get into the corporate world and corporate sales and corporate management. And then that's when I started growing the collection a little bit more on the home front. So sorry to be distracted. I got a bull mastiff to my left that came over and realized I'm in the office. So he's distracting me over here.
That's awesome.
We'll give a quick look there. So, all right.
God, so cute.
Yeah, he's not a Malinois. I give him and his sister, that's a Borbal or a South African Mastiff, a mile or two hike in the morning, and then they're pretty chill the rest of the day. So back on track. So Bearded Dragon money really was the founding money to get into green tree pythons. And so I had bearded dragons, green tree pythons, and Brazilian rainbow boas. And actually at the Indianapolis Reptile Show, after I moved back to Indiana, working in the corporate world, I set up a booth with Brazilian rainbow boas and bearded dragons. And I had been wanting Ackies, either yellow or red Ackies. And crazy enough, I'd never seen yellow Ackies at a show ever. And somebody had, I'm trying to think. Yeah, it was just 3 yellow Ackies, and because of the care, and this was somebody that they bought and resold animals, and they were at shows frequently where that was not myself. They wanted something that was easier to care for, that they could keep in a Rubbermaid shoebox, and so Brazilian rainbow boas fit that bill. And so I think I traded 9 of my Brazilian rainbow boas for these 3 yellow Ackies, and that's how those were my first dwarf monitors. And I kind of felt like they were already going to be my niche with the dwarf monitors. But after getting them, I was totally bought into the dwarf monitors. And from there, really started, I'm trying to think what year that was. That was probably 2001 or 2002.
Okay.
So, 22 years ago, I guess, or 23 years ago. So from there, really took a deeper dive into looking for more of the dwarf monitor species. And at the time, this is pre, well, I think it was pre king snake, or at least I wasn't savvy to, king snake and a bunch of posting on there. So it took me a year and a half, 2 years to find somebody with Kimberly rock monitors. And that was Rare Earth before my time. And that was under a different owner. And so in securing some Kimberly rock monitors that were incubating, and incubation takes about 110 days with those guys, I was selling more lizards and snakes on my end. And as those were incubating, I was talking to the previous owner more, and he let me know that he had some freckled monitors and he had some black-headed monitors, and I'm trying to think what else it was. I guess at that point that so what started at 3 Kimberly rock monitors turned into 5 Kimberly rock monitors and 4 black-headed monitors and 3 freckle monitors, and so that was my first shipment of dwarf monitors from the previous owner at Rare Earth. And I'll tell a quick story about the craziness of that first shipment. So this was Delta Dash was the safest way to operate, back then. And it sounds kind of crazy to say it, but this was the first week of January that these were being shipped, but they were supposed to go direct from East Coast, direct to me. So this package gets lost. Delta Dash, just MIA. There's like no tracking on it. And so, and this is pre-phase change packs. And so you probably got a 40-hour heat pack or 2 in this box. And so, and one, it's humongous dollars, for me, but it's more the rarity of the animal, if that's the important thing, because there was no replacing these from anybody in the country. So it really wasn't the money as much, which the money was a big deal, but it was more the rarity of these animals. And it was basically, irreplaceable animals with these. And so I think it was 3 days that they were lost. And so you think wintertime, first week of January, they're toast. These animals are toast. It turned out somehow they ended up in Cincinnati, and then they got to me in northern Indiana. And at this point, the lady at Delta, she had heard, I'd probably called her 8 to 10 times, and Brandon calling the 10th time, and she's like, she called me and said the box was here, and I said, well, can you just open it up and see if anybody's alive in there? And she's like, yeah, they're alive, they're moving. And so it was wild. This is a long time ago, but I think it was like 4 or 5 days that it took for them to get here in transit, and they were all in perfect health. And boy, one story just leads to another story. I've built my own cages for a really long time, and so I started building my cages in college when I would be home using my dad's tools. I could create everything, and then he could help me build the cages. So I built these. These units were, I guess, they were traditional 4 by 2 by 2 cages.
Yeah,
and then I had these screen vents on the back. And I had Ackies, and I realized they could get all the small spaces, but I had not had, Pilbarensis or Galarte, and the profile top to bottom, as you know, is just next level. And then Galarte even, it's even thinner than the Pilbarensis. And so I get these Kimberleys after, so 110 days of incubation, and then he probably raised them for probably 6 weeks before he sent, or maybe 4 to 6 weeks before he sent them to me. The first day, they all got out underneath these gaps, these teeny tiny gaps. And this my wife and I's first home had a crawl space. So it was like a 4-foot crawl space with these pressurized vent system, underneath there. And so all of the Kimberleys went down these heating vents. And so I'm thinking, there's no way. And so it's crazy. So these things get loose. These things get lost in transit, and then literally within the first day, they're down. They're out of the cage and down these pipes. And I'm thinking, there's no way I get these things back. So I get down in the crawl space, and I'm moving as stealthily as I can. And I don't even know where they're at in my house. I mean, I probably had looked everywhere upstairs first that you could possibly look for these things, and they can hang out in the tiniest of places. But I'm down in my crawl space listening to these little air ducts, and I hear one move, And so I'm scaring these guys back up through these air ducts, but it feels like I'm trying to catch prairie dogs. So I'm scaring them out of these air ducts. But then I'd have to go back to this one center spot, where near my washer and dryer, and come back up. And then there's these blazing fast little lizards that are 3 feet away from the escape once again. So amazingly enough, I did get all of them back, and that was my first shipment of dwarf monitors. But in that process of getting those dwarf monitors, and then I added red Ackies as well from the previous owner. The old school way of operating was not just transactional, where, oh, you've got this nice picture, this is the price, I'm gonna send you money. It's we're gonna have an hour long or a 2 hour long, a comprehensive phone conversation. And so I got to know the previous owner by my standards, spending thousands and thousands, big dollars with him, and picking his brain as much as I could about these species to learn as much as I could and how he was operating with them. And then to fast forward to 2007, so I already had the 5 species that Rare Earth was working with at the time, plus yellow Ackies. And through a friend of mine that was also into dwarf monitors at the time, he turns out he's a big gecko guy, but he was working with dwarf monitors at the time. And he said, hey, did you hear that Rare Earth was shutting down? And I was like, oh, no way. It's like, because to me, Rare Earth had always been the name in dwarf monitors. The Joe Lewis days, he had, a humongous warehouse and had, you name it, as far as snakes and all these different varieties of lizards. But at this point, Rare Earth, through the second owner, was all dwarf monitors. And I had only known the second owner. And so it was only these dwarf monitors. And so to me, it was a dwarf monitor company. And the concept I was going with through my business was going to be called convergent evolution. And so I'm sure you know what that is. So, and this kind of leads back to Chilean dwarf monitors. So, or excuse me, Chilean dwarf tegus. I was going to do dwarf monitors and tegus, the smaller species. And then because I already had green tree pythons, I was going to do green tree pythons and emerald tree boas. And so that convergent evolution was the name that I was thinking of. And I don't know if those are the best examples, but to me, they're filling different niches across the world and about the same. But honestly, because all of the dwarf monitors that I was working with were all rare earth line dwarf monitors, with the exception of the yellow Ackies, I already felt like a mini rare earth. And to me, it was a big bummer that the company was shutting down. And so I called Jason and I said, hey man, what's going on with the company? And due to some unfortunate circumstances that were going on with his wife, and he had kids, he needed to get back to, and as you know, these are expensive lizards that we're working with, and it's not the most stable, if you've got kids and you want a sure thing as far as a cash flow and money coming in, it might not be the best thing to, put all your eggs into that basket. Yeah. So Jason was shutting things down as far as rare earth and getting back to, I can't remember if it was like web design or web marketing, but it was, he was a computer guy. And so basically we chatted and found a mutual agreeable price. I didn't pick up any other animals. I don't even know if he had any other animals at the time, but I got some of the caging systems that they used to use. And so these were these huge plastic tubs with these subterranean lay boxes that were set up with heat tape on thermostats underneath them, which they worked, I think, for Joe Lewis and then for Jason, the second owner, but it just wasn't my mode of operating and what I was comfortable with. And I didn't like that mode. I think that you can definitely get production out of those, but I was really more trying to find the balance of production and then pets. So how do we get the longest life expectancy out of these animals and treat them more like a pet and get some production as well? And so to me, I do prefer whole cage nesting or deep substrate throughout the majority of the enclosure instead of an isolated subterranean lay box. And to me, the more natural way of thinking for these highly intelligent monitors, as they're testing the top of the substrate, if the top of the substrate is, say, 82 degrees, why is it going to be 84 to 86 degrees in that prime nesting zone if I dig 10 inches down into the substrate? Right. And so to me, to have heat from top down and providing that temperature gradient and providing structure where that female is going to be, say, oh, well, it's 88 to 92 right here. If I use this structure and start digging down in this packed soil, well, then I can dig down to some security and find that perfect little zone of that 84 to 86 at the proper temperature. And to me, it long-term production and keeping healthy females more for a pet life expectancy is treating that female like gold and having your nesting as perfect as you possibly can, because these young females, and I'm not picking on anybody out there, but people that get one or two clutches and then think they're dwarf monitor experts because they've done it once or twice. Young dwarf monitors tend to be more naive, and you can treat them more like a bearded dragon than a mature, than a female that's a couple years down the road and she knows what's going to be a little bit healthier for her animals. And so a lot of people put their failures with incubating, or excuse me, with production of dwarf monitors on their incubating techniques, and it starts with the nesting, because if you don't have healthy animals that are nesting on a proper timeline, well, then you're getting these. Well, maybe you're incubating already dead eggs or very weak eggs as well. But if you get perfectly incubated, or excuse me, perfectly nested eggs, well, then your chances of success are going to be way, way higher. They're not bearded dragon eggs, but it's not. And I can't even think of what super difficult eggs are, but healthy nested varrotic eggs are they're not easy, but it's not super hard to hatch them.
Yeah, man, I really resonate with what you just said about, first of all, I really like the term whole cage nesting. I haven't heard it put that way before, so I really like that term. I really appreciate like the sort of you might call it just like a logical approach to what you're offering, because similar things happen with people in uromastyx and at least a handful of other lizards. God, I have so many things to say. I have so many reactions to what you just said.
I know. There's a trigger, a waterfall effect on my end as well.
Yeah. So let me see if I can just try to sum this all up and make it as concise as possible. And again, not picking on anyone in particular, because I actually just recently helped a customer of mine who ended up losing an animal, like a female, to egg binding. And so none of this is intended to criticize him, or, he'll know he's a nice guy. But like giving a Uromastix a nest box that has a top entry, to me it just doesn't make any sense at all, because why would they go up in order to dig down? Like it just doesn't, it's such a bizarre, it's just a wild cognitive thing for me. And even though that shouldn't necessarily be the end all be all of like success or failure, it does speak to something that I think you are saying as well, that like, exactly what moisture range and incubation medium you use isn't really going to move the needle. I'm sure you've had this experience too, which is healthy eggs deposited when and where they were supposed to be deposited, they'll pretty much hatch under a lot of different conditions. They're pretty resilient. Eggs are not these fragile, tiny little, they're meant to be able to endure. That's what they're there for, is to like, let me just get this thing to being viable outside the egg. And so you can I've incubated Uromastix eggs in a very wide range of media and in really, really different and diverse moisture levels inside of that medium as well, like where it could be very, very dry and very, very moist. And I get good hatching out of all of it, all different kinds of circumstances. And so, when people approach and ask about things like, well, what medium do you use and exactly what, how much weight water to medium ratio do you use? I'm like, I don't even know. I don't measure it at all. I just go by feel, and it shouldn't matter, it shouldn't in theory matter that much, the exactitudes, because again, there's a wide range at which this stuff can hatch. So it feels to me like maybe due to possibly outdated concepts of like early herpetoculture, but a lot of people seem to have like this focus on things that just aren't really going to move the needle that much, right? So this, another way that you and I will relate on this is with athleticism and fitness and things like this. You can do all the creatine and omega-3s and infrared lighting and wearing the right shoes all you want, and that might move the needle a little, but it's not going to move the needle as much as consistent fitness training, healthy diet, and good sleep. Just those three things are going to do 90% of what you want to gain out of any endeavor that you participate in. And I think the same thing is true of the reptiles, like good, proper heating and lighting gradients, good nutrition, and a lot of exercise and space. And they're going to do just fine. Most of them are going to do very well, but I really feel like it's just that. Yeah. Sorry.
No, I'm just thinking you got to be careful. You start adding fitness, into this. My head might explode over here, man. I'm like, don't get into triathlon. All right. Yeah. I did run my 14 miles today, but anyways, right. Well, don't get me going on exercise here. You know that. Yeah. Well, I guess just to throw it out there, I will say, just so that people don't take what I say and then what you say and combine it into one. I do like to keep how I incubate them a little bit more specific, and I do measure things, as far as so. Because I have bred a lot of bearded dragons. I mean, I remember just misting over the top of bearded dragon eggs, and you could give female any type of substrate at any temperatures, and she's going to lay. So I do think these guys, even under perfect nesting conditions, I still do like to operate in a little bit more of a specific way as far as the incubation. But to your point, the nesting is the very most important thing. And it's not that the two of us, and we've got the luxury of having worked with thousands and thousands of these particular species that we've been focused on for, and I don't know about you, but for decades for me. And so I never try to pick on my customers that are struggling to hatch things, but there are questions that if you don't kind of know your numbers, then hey, don't be critical on those animals. I mean, you know how it is in the reptile world. We always think there's a flaw.
Sorry.
There, Phil?
Yep, I'm still here. Yeah. My camera turned off for a second. It's gonna pop back on here.
I was gonna say, I don't know if that was you don't like what I'm saying here, so I get the farmer frowning at me here.
No, that's Roy. Oh my God, that's amazing. That's a
oh, sorry.
Because we're sharing the Zoom account, and so
hey, that picture's got character, Roy. I'm not picking
Roy's the best.
I like it.
Farmer.
I have a similar. And I'm basically a farmer over here. I grow any type of fruit tree or perennial crop or annual vegetable. So I got a similar hat. But back on track. So asking. I think it's important with these varanids to have a calendar that you're marking events. If you think a female is swelling, you're marking that down. You should be getting copulation. If she's going through vitellogenesis, she should be getting copulation 2 or 3 days, after that. Mark when you see that copulation, because we're all busy and we're not going to remember exactly what these timelines are. You kind of try to remember, but you never know. So write it down. And then if that female, generally speaking, isn't laying 18 to 21 days after copulation, and it's taking 25 days, and you didn't get a super strong clutch and they didn't hatch, take some responsibility and just be critical on your nesting. And so to me, it's like I try not to beat a dead horse with it, but 9 times out of 10, it all goes back to nesting, with these. It's not that your male's not, infertile. It's like I don't really ever remember having a problem with a male getting a job done ever. And so, get critical on your nesting. And I still have to do it here. Things change. I'm in northern Indiana and the temperatures fluctuate. So if something happens goofy, understand what those temperatures are. Has something changed? Is the moisture levels different? Because 3 to 5 days difference in laying is already, you're starting with much weaker eggs. So, not to beat a dead horse.
No, it's okay. I mean, I think there's a lot here, and just for the sake of clarification too, like I hope it didn't come across as if I was like diminishing the level of like effort.
No. I was kind of half laughing at it because there was a guy that, because of the old school method of like taking vermiculite and making a snowball. And I would always do that with bearded dragons. And I was like, totally fine. But, and so I do use perlite, and not vermiculite. Not that vermiculite's not fine, but I thought there was carcinogens in it. And I didn't want the dust from the vermiculite is why I changed over. And so I use perlite. So clearly you can't make like a snowball with perlite, but this customer, and I'm not laughing at him, I'm laughing with him, but he was making snowballs with the perlite. And so it was, zero out the container, make sure you got a scale, zero out the container, add the dry perlite, write down the weight on that, zero it again, and then add the moisture. And so with the dwarf monitors, slightly less water to dry perlite is how I operate with those guys. And Ackie eggs, you really don't have to do much other than just like a single hole in the lid of the container. But like Pilbarensis and the Glarte, if you have it too humid in there and those eggs are not able to expel that water near the end of incubation, you can get, full-term dead babies in there. So essentially drowning in the egg, because if you've got 100% humidity, saturation in there, well, then the egg can't, get rid of that excess moisture that it needs to. And so,
yeah, no, for sure, man. And it's the same thing with uromastics in the way that, you said taking a little bit of responsibility and like maybe just kind of being willing to reimagine the way you do things. People will message me very frequently and say, hey, like I have these euros. It's this setup. I got eggs. I've gotten eggs 2 years in a row, but each year the eggs don't hatch, and I'm starting to think, it's the same like what you said. Oh, my male's not viable, or there's something going on, or there's something wrong. Am I using the wrong lighting? Am I using the wrong diet? Am I using the wrong whatever? And I'm like, okay, let's just rewind and let's talk about two things. Do you keep the pair together year round, like all year? Are they forced to stay together constantly? And the answer 90% of the time is yes. And if the answer is no, because either they've read my care guide, or they like doing things separately too, or they maybe I've had people even ask me and make the change and keep their animals split for most of the year, and then just introduce for mating and then split again after that. And they've, almost all of them, once they split the animals, their success goes up. And it's like, well, yeah, because these are super highly territorial lizards, and the way they express their territoriality isn't always just through beating the crap out of one another and fighting. Sometimes it comes by way of this weird suppressive behavior where one animal monopolizes all the resources in the enclosure, and the other animal is too frightened and will stay hidden, or even if it doesn't stay hidden all the time, it either has to endure constant pressure from its cage mate of some kind, which is stress. That's a baseline level of stress. Or it is forced to operate under the cycles of its cage mate, in the sense that it is only going to come out and bask when its cage mate has gone to sleep, or it's only going to come out and get scraps of food left over from its cage mate, or something along those lines. And so 90% of the time, just splitting them up and then introducing them in the springtime for breeding not only results in more closely synced cycles, but also just results in a healthier female, because she's not constantly getting pestered by the male. And then all your production goes up because they're not under the same level of stress. If it's not that, then it is almost always the second problem, which is really inadequate nest boxes, right? So it's either a poorly constructed nest box that's too small, it's clear instead of opaque. There's never going to be light inside their nests out in the wild, right? Or
here are predators. Here are my eggs.
Exactly. Or maybe it's like it's decently constructed, but it's top entry and it's on the cold side of the enclosure. And it's like, I tell people all the time, you want to give them the choice to choose a little warmer or a little cooler based on what their biology is telling them. So you want to place that large side entry or down entry nest box in the middle of the enclosure with a gradient from one side to the other. You're going to find usually they're going to lay right in the middle. And if it's too hot, they're going to lay all the way up against the cold side of that cooler end of that nest box. If it's too cold, they're going to cram their eggs on the hotter end of that nest box. So you can use their choices as a gauge to decide where it might best be placed in the enclosure. But it's very rare, I find, that it's not as common for people to want to relinquish some of these aspects of their care, because either A, it's worked for them in the past, B, it's worked for another animal, or C, the daunting task of splitting animals that they've kept together for a long time is just a bit of too heavy of a lift for them, which I don't disrespect those pieces of rationale. I just don't find them adequate for myself. I really think you should still make those choices if your goal is to do this in a way that is going to end with you getting the most success that you can. So there becomes a point that if you're going to get into some of these higher end animals, there's just a level of commitment. And if you're, meaning if a really nice Uromastic species,
you should be capable of having 2 enclosures. The excuse shouldn't be, well, I only have 1 cage. I have to keep them together.
Right.
Maybe you shouldn't keep this species then.
Right. Totally. And it's even more interesting to see there's some pretty unique quirks between species too, which I didn't really have a respect for up until, I don't know, maybe the last 3 or 4 years, where, for example, Eurymastix thomasi, they don't do too well with this same kind of standard nests that I offer a lot of the other species. They just don't recognize the box in the same way. I almost always put that animal that's gravid in its own, like in a whole cage nesting situation, as you described earlier, right? So it's a whole enclosure and they can just lay wherever they want. Because if I don't, that'll quite literally mean the difference between them holding the eggs for 6 weeks and laying them at 4.5 or 5. It's like, that's a huge difference. And all of those factors that cause the female to retain or push off laying their eggs just increases that egg mortality, because it's, again, you mentioned it earlier, it's weak eggs, damaged eggs, maybe just a level of either toxic stress or inviability because they were supposed to. Maybe is something more molecular than that I'm not even aware of, right? That it's just way over my head. It's a really intriguing topic. And so that would actually, I want to give you a little time if you had more to say to that but I have other questions.
Well, I guess before we move on, just because, hopefully some Dwarf Monitor people actually listen to this. I also recognize that there are so many different ways of operating with success as well. And I recognize that not everybody wants to do whole cage nesting.
Right.
And the reality is there are some species that don't do a whole ton of digging outside of, their nesting event. And so that's not saying that you even have to do whole cage nesting. To me, the benefit of deep substrate throughout is definitely a much wider range of temperature options as far as nesting, but then just the mass stability that provides as far as temperatures are concerned and humidity is concerned, especially if you're in temperate climates where, if you lose power or something there, it's a nice cushion there. But with say like Kimberly rock monitors, maybe you don't need a whole ton of substrate, or you don't need whole cage nesting. But I would recommend going with the largest nest box option that you can, kind of, what you're saying as well, because when there are seasonal temperature changes, well, maybe one time of the year it works directly underneath the basking spot, and another time of the year you got to have it in the center of the enclosure, or maybe even on the cool end of the enclosure in those really warm summer months. But the larger the nesting box, the more option, temperature option, and security option, and humidity option you can provide.
Right. Absolutely, man. I couldn't agree more. So you have some pretty remarkable enclosures. Like, they're pretty beautiful the way you set these things up. Can you kind of talk about, what kind of thinking goes into, how you're choosing and what kind of choices and considerations you're making when you construct an enclosure? Obviously all of the, there's a lot of things that are maybe specific to you, like how much space you have, which species it is, and exactly how you're heating and lighting. And I'm not exactly talking about that in particular. I'm talking a little bit more about what kind of, I'm trying to figure out how to ask this question. Like, what kind of inspiration and visual tools are you using to construct the interiors of your enclosures? And are you putting together interior setups that are relatively permanent, or are they more designed to be a little bit flexible, where you can change things and kind of based on what you're seeing out of your animals?
Yeah. So I guess you touched on a number of different things, because I've got a number of different cage styles. Right. I guess the craziest enclosures that I have. So basically, I moved into my current home in 2007. So right as I was taking over Rare Earth, and I knew the previous owners. I went to high school with the daughter, and so they built this house. And so actually, the first thing I did to this house, which was it's a very big unfinished basement, is I partitioned off for phase one reptile room. And so partitioned off with a sliding glass door, phase one reptile room, and so in that I do have some cattle troughs. I have some front access enclosures and some stackable units. And I guess we can come back to those stackable units after we talk about, like I guess like the craziest of enclosures that I have. So as I kind of started to fill up that phase one room, and decided I wanted to do this second phase room, I really started designing those cages based off of the space that I had available. Right. And so as I thought about the enclosures, a lot of times people, when they build an enclosure, if they're thinking about a single standalone unit, they leave a lot of vertical space above it. And so as I was trying to maximize this space, I just said, well, why am I just not using from floor to ceiling, in here? Because in the wild, we like to label them as, arboreal or fossorial or, terrestrial. Whereas, I guess with like Kimberleys and the Tristis subspecies, people like to say, oh, well, those are arboreal, so you need more vertical height with them. But then the terrestrial ones, you need, they don't need the height. But the reality is all of these dwarf monitors, they will use every inch of height that we give them. And I'm not giving anybody 20 feet of height, but if I was, they would be utilizing all of that. But I could give them 7 feet of height in this space that I was utilizing. So I decided to make these, I call them concrete rockwork enclosures. The dimensions on those units are 3 wide, 5 deep, and 7 tall. Amazing. And so those have full view storm doors that you could open up, and it's silly, but because they're all fast little lizards, initially it was like, well, I'd like to be able to get into the enclosure and shut the door behind me so that the animals can't get out, which is no big deal, because it's even if they did get out, there's no hiding places in this bare, basically like zigzag hallway that they go through. But I just decided to utilize all of the space from floor to ceiling and basically just utilize the whole wall space on one side of it in this phase two reptile room. And so I boxed all of these out, and I guess the primary thing that I thought about is that I did want a lot of substrate, in these enclosures. And so what I classify as the dirt dam area. So 2 feet from 2 feet from where the storm doors are, 3 foot high. Is it 3 feet? No, 2 feet. 2 foot high. 2 foot high dirt dam occurs, and so I could have an area of 2 feet of dirt. What would it be? 3 feet deep and 2 feet wide. Wow. Now I don't fill all of those up to the brim, because I've just learned over time that, to me, like 16 inches is like well more enough of substrate that you really want and need to be dealing with. To me, 12 to 14 is probably enough. Some dwarf monitor people say, well, you have to have 24 inches or it's, basically animal cruelty. And to me, I think that's just silliness, because anything much above that 12 to 14 or definitely 16, it's just more dirt that you have to manage. And if you have several of these units, the more you have to manage, the bigger of a project it is to stir up that nesting, to know what the heck is going on where those females are going to be nesting, is right. You're more likely to put off that project and not check what's going on with nesting, not dig for those eggs. And so you end up neglecting those conditions more. So I keep usually about 15 or 16 inches in those enclosures. So deeper substrate in there, I guess, was priority one. And one big flaw that a lot of people have with vertically oriented cages in these dwarf monitors that are a lot of times nesting lower is that they have all of their heat lighting all the way up at the top, on the top of the screen. Well, if you've got a 4-foot high unit or taller, how is all of that heat going to penetrate from 4 feet or 6 foot up all the way down to that substrate if you don't have any kind of like heat tape or, something else heating that down low? And like we talked about earlier, I do like to use the lighting heat because I find it to be more natural, and it's easier as far as us keepers to understand what's going on as far as the temperature gradient, as opposed to side heat or under mat heat. And once again, I know there's a lot of people that are quality keepers having a lot of success with heat tape on thermostats. So I'm not saying that that's fully a bad idea. Sure. But what I found is sometimes with bottom heat, well, everything can seem great, but as you dig down, well, it's cooking down at the bottom, or you've dried out those bottom like 2 or 3 inches where that female maybe, if you only had say 10 inches, that female might want to dig all the way down to the bottom. But then if it's totally dried out because you don't know what's going on, it's problematic. Right. So on those enclosures, I built an opportunity for 2 heat bulbs that's going to be heating that dirt that's down lower, and then a higher basking zone in there. And then it's got UV fluorescent bulbs for more of the ambient lighting and UV opportunity as well up high. I did find, it was a big project, so I try not to be too long-winded with it. But basically, building those cages, so there's 9 of those concrete rockwork enclosures. I pushed the limits of my wife's patience harder in that 6-month period of me building those than I ever have, because what happened is I built out 9 of these units. So 8 of them are the 3 wide, 7 tall, 5 deep, and then one of them is an 8 by 6 by 5, which has an AC unit up above that enclosure. Yeah, and that one's kind of really crazy because it's got a huge glass front on it, and actually it's a 10-foot long photographic mural that the center of the mural is actually the door that you open up to get into it. So it's super zoo-like. And so, the photographic murals on there, and that one's of Ayers rock, so it's Ayers rock on that. And so it's photographic mural that I laid on plywood and then put like clear epoxy over that to protect those photographic murals. But the point is that I built out all 9 of those enclosures and said, which was like a huge project by itself just to build the frames out for those. And I said, I want to do some concrete work in one of these, is what I initially said. And so I did some smaller, a smaller kind of like diorama unit to try to decide what kind of rock work I was going to do. And so I did some of the foam and molding the foam out and putting on top of that. And then I'm trying to think what else I used. I used like foam board. And then I also used like some spray foam. And then I used wire lath. And to me, because this is a forever home for myself, and I wanted to be able to, I didn't want these cages breaking down. And I really kind of wanted them to be forever units. And so these units are wire lath. And the inspiration, to answer that question, the inspiration is, what I did was find photographs that, this is where the monitor is from, or it's just gorgeous, like an Ayers rock. And so then I tried to emulate the rock work, the concrete rock work, based off of Kakadu National Park or Ayers Rock or these different environments where and they're not all exactly where the lizard's from, but they are all Australian national parks. And so Most of the enclosures do have photographic murals on the wall, so I could kind of use that for inspiration as I was kind of molding and pounding on the wire lath. And I don't know if you've ever worked with wire lath, but the more you like bend and flex wire lath, the more rigid that it becomes and the more sturdy that it becomes. And so I was doing one unit with this wire lath. And then I'm trying to sort out how do I do the concrete on it. And so initially I thought I was going to use like a spray hopper. And so I don't know if you've ever seen people work with like the spray gunite. And so the problem is this isn't some 2-story high chimpanzee exhibit while you're outdoor able to spray this big gunite gun. These are small for kind of trying to spray. And then to get the right consistency of this concrete that could go through the hopper appropriately and then still stick to that wire lath was a royal pain. And then once you got closer to the ceiling, that hopper is hitting the ceiling and everything. So ultimately what I ended up doing was grinding up a mortar base and then a Portland cement in about 50-pound batches. Wow. And I would basically make these hamburger consistency and make a kind of a big hamburger and then press it up onto that wire lath. And that would create the initial base on all of the wire lath that was in the general shape. And then I would come back with an Elmer's glue solution and I would spray all of that. And then I would put a second coat of hamburger patty concrete on top of that. And that second coat, what allowed me to kind of carve out to make it look like the rock from whichever national park it was. And so those cages, they got completely out of control. I did one of them and thought, well, that's really cool. Why don't I just do one more? And then after I did like a couple, I thought, man, I can't have, 2 or 3 of these looking incredible. And then the other ones just looking like these kind of lame boxes. So then I just decked them all out. And this one, it was pretty funny, Phil. It literally like mentally broke me. I was working. I was working at this like it was a full-time job. This is the one that's supposed to look like Kakadu National Park, and there's not even a mural in it. And so the day one, I kind of and I had a picture of a rocky outcropping from Kakadu National Park and taped to the wall for inspiration. And I carved it out. Day one, I was like, oh, that looks pretty good. And then day two, I was like, oh, that's looking even more real. And then day three, it looked totally real. And I was like, oh, I got it. But day three, it was so detailed that I ended up doing the rest of the enclosure as detailed as day three. And it literally took me 2 weeks of like working at this thing like it was a job. And so at one point, I'm sitting in that dirt dam area, chiseling it away. And it would take me like 2 hours to do like this, 2 foot by 1.5 foot section because it looks like completely real rock. Yeah. And I took like ceramics and a lot of art classes in high school and in college. So it helped with the art a little bit, but I was sitting in there and I realized once I put cork tubes and other cage furniture in there, I thought, I'm never even going to see this from the front of the enclosure. And I thought to myself, what am I doing with my life? spending 6 hours working on concrete to look, to make it look like real rock. So long short, after 6 months, all of the cages got done and it looked remarkable. And actually the Ayers rock, to mimic the Ayers rock, that was the easiest because that was smooth. And I was able to put like plastic sheeting over it. And then I could kind of carve it and dimple it. And so, you basically come over with, and cut me off if I'm getting too long with these darn cages. But, okay.
Yeah.
So I basically get a base coat of paint by spraying on a base coat of color on it. And then you come with a highlight and a low light. And then you could airbrush in like the little cracks and the little dimples and stuff. But it turned out looking pretty real. The Ayers rock was relatively easy to do. And then there was one other cage that was similar to the Kakadu one that was totally overboard, but it was when it was all done, it was a great project, but never again will I build cages to that extent because I like being married. So
Oh man, that is such an impressive commitment to giving them something really over the top. I mean, I think that's just excellent, you know, like in some ways, that's kind of how I would like, you know, in my mind, I'm like, oh, that sounds great. I love the idea of being able to do something like that for the Euros or for some of the other stuff that I have. I mean, it talk about a dream, you know, that's that's some pretty incredible stuff.
But it's totally overboard though, because you can imagine how many people and zoos. I mean, literally zoos were contacting me wanting to like fly me out to like work on those cages. But I couldn't, you know, the amount of time that I knew it took me 6 months. So I'm not I was not a professional, and I didn't have a week long and I could create some amazing cage. And also, you know, I didn't know the life expectancy, you know, of these
Right.
cages, either. But I guess, you know, to the podcast point, I do feel like it elevated the level of rare earth for sure, because, you know, I'm not keeping them in 4x2x2 boxes. You know, it's people respect the fact that these are amazing animals that if you can provide next level, you know, housing, then why not do it? And I know there's been a wave of more naturalistic keeping and just people just upping their levels. And I think it's great that everybody just kind of feeds off of each other. I was looking more at like zoo designs when I was doing it, but I know there's a lot of people that have done stuff like what I've done or similar as well.
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely always really admirable to see the level at which people will go to really enrich the lives of their pets. I mean, it's just it's out of control, and it makes me think about, you know, another topic that I wanted to bring up with you, and you know, of course, I don't intend this to be, when I ask this question, it's not intended to be to try to get you to like industry bash, as some people have called this, but like when you look at herpetoculture broadly, what are some of the areas where you feel like maybe we could make the biggest improvement on average, and sort of why is it, do you feel that way? Because, you know, part of why I ask is because, you know, obviously there's a lot, our industry is really, really new and young in various ways. And, you know, we sort of started off some of the conversation with talking about always wanting to be kind of on like the good side of the, like legally and ethically, trying to be on like the better end of that is sort of a goal. And you mentioned the way that herpetoculture is changing. It's moving towards this more naturalistic, or at least it appears to be moving towards a more naturalistic way of doing things. You know, I kind of wonder at times if we're headed towards something that resembles a little bit more of like reef tanks and saltwater aquaria, or if we're, you know, maybe going to find some like middle ground between the way things are done on average and that realm. I don't know if we're going to see like a complete split and have like the more naturalistic aquaria type individuals, and then over here the more let's say domesticated angle of herpetoculture. I don't know. I mean, do you ever speculate on that?
Well, I do. And I guess I would say, you know, I do feel like I have stayed a little bit on the periphery of the reptile world, and I fully respect the guys that are hitting shows, you know, every single weekend, and that's how they operate, and they're living online, you know, constantly talking to reptile people. And like, I fully respect what you guys are doing with this podcast, because I think conversations like this, I mean, it gives you a remarkable reptile energy. I'm sure the same way with your jujitsu. If you weren't around jujitsu people all the time, well, where's your passion going to be for that? And so I feel like I've stayed on the periphery. A lot of it's to keep the blinders on so that I don't get distracted by all these other cool species that are out there, and to keep the blinders on because I always felt like there was enough going on with the dwarf monitors for me to focus on that. And then obviously, as you know, I kind of got hooked on the Agurnia as well and opened those doors. So that's part of the reason why I've kept the blinders on. But I guess to get a little bit more on track with your question, I do feel like the two sides, if there's sides to that, they are already bickering at each other. And I do think that there's a balancing act. And I do think that it works for some species and it doesn't work for some species, because this is not the wild. And I do feel like some people are going over the top as far as the bioactivity with some species as well. And it's not something that I fight against with people looking into dwarf monitors. But what I try to tell people is, first and foremost, this has got to be a dwarf monitor enclosure before bioactivity is the most important thing. This is not a dart frog enclosure where you're going to have humidity everywhere that's going to allow for your isopods and all this other bioactivity. It's going to be a 10% or less portion of this arid type environment that we've kept them in, that might have a small amount of decomposers or saprophages maybe helping out a little bit. And so it makes me uptight when people are talking to me more like this is a dart frog enclosure and I never even want to pick up poop inside of this enclosure. They don't say that, but it's I know. It's just not realistic. Yeah, that's not realistic to do with a Euro tank or with an arid dwelling dwarf monitor species. And so, I don't think you should push the agenda too hard with that. And I don't have great examples of species that might be stressed out by too large of an enclosure, too natural of an enclosure. I know there's plenty of people that get annoyed and by a more sensitive snake species that say you can overwhelm them. That's not the case with dwarf monitors. I mean, sometimes a gigantic naturalistic enclosure could, like a single dwarf monitor, maybe it's a little bit shyer if you set it up like that. But for the most part with me, if a dwarf monitor knows that it can find a secure hide within inches instead of having to run 3 feet, it's going to feel more secure. So, these people that have a high basking zone that's at the appropriate temperature. So let's say, 120 degrees, but it's got to travel 3 feet to find a secure, tight crevice to be in. Well, that's going to be a shy monitor. But if that same monitor has like 2 or 3 options to get to a nice little hide, it's not going to be as uptight. And so I just think there's benefits to going more natural with these dwarf monitors at times.
Yeah.
Bearing cages with limited to no hides. And I know there is like one mainstream guy that really like promotes that and for lack of a better term, like the disciples or the guys that love that type of care, I see it. But when I see dwarf monitors up and they're on like a grid, like a metal grid underneath the basking, I mean, that's nails on a chalkboard to me, because it's hot and dry up there. And so where there are tighter hides, the temperature gradient is probably lower than optimum anyways. And so if it's got to be like in the low 80s where it feels secure, it's, it's not going to be, its metabolism is not going to be up high enough. So they're going to be operating suboptimally, kind of like that chronic stress that you talked about in those subordinate Euros.
Yeah, man. That's such an interesting perspective too, like thinking about the ways in which this drive towards naturalism in our enclosures seems to almost be pushing the animal out of the picture a little. It's like or at least it in a way, it's like there's this, I'm sure you've seen this go around the medias from time to time, but you'll have like, people say things like, well, my animal should never be hungry. It should never be thirsty. It should always feel safe. It should always have access to whatever, which like, obviously those are like a good thing, on a certain like ethical level. And yes, the animal didn't necessarily ask to be brought out of the wild into captivity. They also didn't necessarily didn't ask to be born in the wild either, but, I'm getting a little long-winded on this, but like captivity also has freedom from other things as well. It's like by being in captivity, he's never going to have to deal with predators. He's never going to have to deal with finding a mate easily because they're going to be there. We're going to provide mates for them. But like, it's also not so one-dimensional. Sometimes being a little hungry and a little thirsty and a little cold and a little hot is good for you, right? Sometimes it's a good thing, right? I don't want an animal that has easy, immediate access to every single thing it could possibly need at any minute of the day. Sometimes I want them to work for their food. Sometimes I want them to go without food for a short period of time. Sometimes I want them to get very cold because they would get quite cold in the wild. You know, you say what you will about readings of burrows and, you know, like, this is a common thing that people will cite with uromastyx. They'll cite field studies that note burrow temperature. And that's great. That burrow temperature might be a very consistent temperature, but they're not always in their burrow. They're not there constantly. They're not there every night. You mentioned when you were talking about eventually naming your work Convergent Evolution. Well, chuckwallas and uromastyx are basically this. They're like such a similar creature in terms of the ecological niche in which they inhabit. Their behaviors are super similar. I have been in Arizona in March, like mid-March, when it's getting down into the 40s, in high 40s and low 50s at night, and you'll find chuckwallas in crevices between rocks where there's nowhere else for them to go. They were there all night long. They were in this super cold, you know, and yeah, okay, maybe that animal was a few degrees warmer in that crevice, but it still got damn cold. And it would be a hard sell to convince me that wasn't good for the animal on some level. Now, obviously, we don't need to go extreme here. You know, I feel like it's a kind of a nice balancing act, right? So some of that naturalistic setup, it's great as maybe as like a compass and as an informant, but I don't know if I think it's the right thing to just be as granular and rigid. It just like naturalism is the only way, and getting to proper, like the closest I can get my enclosure to mimic the wild, it's an absolute net good, and that's the better. I don't know if I'm fully sold on that particular angle. I know that was long-winded. Maybe that didn't make a lot of sense.
No, but I was just thinking a little bit about mastability in the wild compared to all these little boxes that we have. And we just can't ever, I mean, I've got an insane amount of mastability just because of the amount of dirt and because of the amount of concrete. So the temperatures coming up and down fluctuate a whole lot slower. But you think about somebody that only has 10 animals or 3 enclosures, you just can't ever get close to that same mastability that the wild is going to provide. But I think maybe you asked a couple things when you initially brought up this subject about like what I see as like the downside as far as like some keepers or people trying to get into herpetoculture. And I totally recognize that it's a great thing for people to want to be entrepreneurs and start businesses. But I do really struggle with the people that like the first conversation they have with me and they don't even have experience with dwarf monitors or super limited. And they're just adamant on this is going to be a business. This is what I'm going to do. And and I'm not saying somebody with that ultimate drive to make this whatever species that they're not familiar with currently, I'm not saying they couldn't turn that into a business, but that's a very limited individual that could, if that passion and that love isn't there first. It's like, treat it as a hobby, treat it as a, support your hobby first before it ever, grows into anything else. And I recognize, sometimes you just have to go full tilt and you have to turn it into business, and everybody's circumstances are different. But the people that it's money first and then the animal, you see them come and go as well over the decades. If they're not passionate about whatever that species is, they're not going to cut it, or at least it seems like 99 out of 100 of them don't. Reinvest. I mean, not to go all the way back to childhood,
No, do
but
it.
I wasn't into electronics. I didn't, the only thing I ever spent money on was reinvesting into reptiles. And I'm not saying that that's the way anybody should live, but even in college, well, I had a TV. The only reason I had a little TV is because my girlfriend bought me a TV, because I wouldn't have bought myself a TV. I would have bought another reptile enclosure or something else for it. So it's reinvest, into your reptiles, like you're reinvesting. If it is going to be a business, you can't pull from it, very early on, or you're just pulling the legs out on what you're trying to accomplish.
Oh yeah.
Well, yeah. And we don't have to dive too deep into it, but I think I've told you, COVID, my wife with cancer, and Ironman triathlon were huge distractions, for me. And all I did was continue to pull instead of continue, because you feel like you've done it. When you've done it for decades, you can feel like you're on cruise control, but you can't, with any kind of business, regardless of how long you're doing it, you got to reinvest back in your business, continually, or, things decline.
Yeah.
My and my point is, my collection size compared to 5 years ago is way down, and it's because sell everything and keep pulling from it. You got to reinvest in your business.
Right. And sometimes that reinvestment isn't just monetary, right? Like sometimes that reinvestment is more time, more research, changes of pace, changes of perspective, changes of angle, right? Like that can make huge differences in the way you conceive of every aspect of what you do in terms of care.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, time, and the three things that I said, there was financial there, for sure, but time, time, COVID, it was time with family. Cancer, it was definitely time with family, and put money in the bank. Well, both of those were. So yeah, combination of time and money for sure.
Well, so so we're right up on 2 hours, which is great, because like the longer convo, but in an interest of being respectful of your time, I have just a few questions left that I'd love to ask before we get to the final one. Let me see if I can get on these. One would be, given all of the interests that you have, right? You have this wonderful and interesting collection of monitors. You have a really interesting and cool, brilliant family life. And you're doing these triathlons, and you mentioned your wife having cancer, all this stuff. How do you stay like sane and balanced? That's like, I feel like that's a pretty substantial. That's like, I imagine your days being very full, and so I'm curious if you have any insight into maintaining a little bit of sanity and balance in what you do, and maintaining motivation and things like this. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think, you kind of hit on the health front earlier. I don't think you can operate and juggle all those things if treating your, you can't take your health for granted, and, hiccups, that we've had in priority checks. And one big thing I didn't hit on earlier was why I left the corporate world and started growing rare earth bigger, is I had premature twins, and my twins were in the NICU for over 100 days. And prior to that happening, was working in the corporate world, trying to kind of keep up with the Joneses, and I'm driving a Cadillac CTS, and I'm wearing a suit to work every day. And when that happened with the twins, the wife and I said, what are we doing here? That's not what the most important things are to us. But to talk about the business of the days is definitely starting days early, treating yourself well. I definitely eat very healthy, and I'm 47 now. I went through phases of a little bit more drinking, a little bit more partying, but I recognize I can't push my body to the max and still do that same stuff anymore. Excuse me, I gotta ignore this. But I guess to answer your question, it can't all be done. It can't all be done. I went so deep into that Iron Man world. I have to reel that back in because there is all these big extras, and so that has been honed down from full Iron Mans because those things turn into training like a full-time job. And
Well, yeah.
now I'm doing half Iron Mans, which are still crazy races, and that's getting closer to a very good life balance. So this year has been a better life balance for not to dwell on the triathlon, but that's doing one big race a year, and it's not looking at 2 or 3 big races a year. But it's really finding that balance. But on the reptile business front, it's cutting out the time and making that to-do list and making those the first priorities of the day instead of the triathlon workout the first priority of the day. And so it's just prioritizing. I'll say how busy I am, but I know how much you're juggling over there as well.
Yes.
So, and the other way that I look at it, Phil, on my front is that I have 14-year-olds, twins, and a 12-year-old. And so it's family has got to be first because soon enough, those kids are going to be off into college. And so when those kids are off into college, then we jump deeper back into regrowing the business bigger and the other priorities. So it's just juggling those priorities.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I definitely partially selfishly asked that question and I'm not doing it right yet. I don't know what I need
to do. No, it wasn't a great answer. It can't all be done every day. That to-do list that you ambitiously put out the night before, the morning of, it doesn't all happen. I had a great list starting today, but the wife was gone. And so you think you're busy until you have 3 kids that wrap up their school year. And then at 11 o'clock, Dad, come pick me up down here in town. And Dad, I got to go to the movie theaters here. So it's, half the day gets shot. And so how did I take a full day to myself for granted last week,
Yeah, for sure. I all too real, frankly, minus the kid part for now, because I got one on the way. So we'll see.
Congrats on that. I won't get off on any other non-reptile tangents over here.
Oh, it's okay. No, actually, the next question is also like, it may or may not be reptile related, but like, if you could give yourself a piece of advice, if you could, flashback 20, 30 years, say, and you give yourself a piece of advice, what would it be?
I would have even more restricted blinders on myself as far as the amount of species that I worked with, because there's so many glamorous animals and you're crazy ambitious with all that you're working with for sure, man. I definitely look at the insane collection that you got going on, but I wouldn't have gone as wide as I did, as early as I did, because the times when family priorities came up and these other big things, it's hard to stay on track and keep the species rolling. And especially when you work with rare species, you naively think, well, there's enough people working with these in the US, this species is going to continue to roll. And that's just not the case with some of these. I mean, there were some species that I used to work with that they're not around anymore. And that's because you just think, well, somebody else is working with them, but those other people are thinking the same thing. And those other people have, other life priorities that come up. And there's a very few amount of people over the last 20 or 30 years that reptiles have always been a number 1, 2, or 3 priority.
Yeah, right, man. Speaking my language and just singing things that I love everything you're saying right now. I mean, it is. I think this actually harkens back a little bit to what we were talking about at the beginning of the conversation with, thinking about the old days and like the kind of cool stuff that would occasionally come in and you could get your hands on at a show. I think part of what makes those, like, reminiscing about some of those times so interesting is because you almost think, man, if I had the chance, if I knew now, or if I knew then what I know now, then I would have bought those shingleback skinks, or I would have kept those.
Oh yeah.
whatever, toward insert
Varanus catulinianus,
Right. You name it. And it's like, damn it. I think about that all the time. I think about a pair of what were then Uromastyx hardwicki and are now Sara hardwicki, the Indian Uromastyx. I mean, there was a pair of them at the shop I worked at when I was in high school. I mean, that's $5,000 of animal right now. If they came into the United States right now, somehow they'd be insanely expensive, but we don't have them. Probably not going to get them again, at least not likely for a long time or ever. And so you almost look back on you and you reminisce about it. And that's kind of you mentioned my collection. That's kind of what keeps me. That's one of the things that keeps me really, really interested in the number of things that I keep, because almost everything that I keep, with the exception of a few small projects like the Hosmeri that I got from you, I have a couple of weird random tortoises. Other than that, just about everything I keep is stuff that underserved, sporadically or rarely imported, maybe not going to be imported again forever. Very few people keep a commitment to them, and they're hold in the United, and they're misunderstood. That's just kind of where my interest, and they happen to be desert lizards. It just happens to be a random thing where my interests kind of lie. But really, it's they'll disappear. They'll be gone. They'll just be gone, plain and simple, gone. And there's nothing you can do about it. You can't get them again. You missed the boat. I think about this all the time.
Well, and it's super easy when you're trying to support this hobby or make a business out of it to sell babies immediately. And you have to hold back babies, and you cannot just keep operating with one pair or two pair. If it's something that is rare and you want to keep going, you need to have a decent group of those animals. There's a number of species that I decided to cut loose, and people think that there's something wrong with that species. Varanus kingorum. Why would you not work with Varanus kingorum anymore? Varanus primordius. And I have these other species that I like slightly more, and there's only so many cages, and there's only so much time. And so you just have to make some of those tough choices and hope that other people are continue to work with those other species. But right now, and there was one thing I thought you guys were going to ask me. Well, what next project are you excited about? And it sounds so boring, but it's continuing what I have. And if I'm still working with these same species that of monitors and Egernia in 10 years, I will be extremely happy about that. So I don't need anything new. I just want to continue to be able to offer the great species that I currently work with.
I mean, that's the Ironman athlete talking, though. Like, it's an endurance game in a way, it's like, because conceivably there could come a time in your future where you're like the only person in the world who's been breeding Varanus pilbarensis for 50 years. Like that.
Well, that won't be me, because I don't work with those anymore. So
you don't have them anymore? Oh, damn. All right. Well, okay.
No. No. But I hear you. Yeah.
Well, you know what I mean. So it's like it's
yes, for sure.
Yeah, and again, something that I relate to profoundly, because I made this decision over the last few years. I reduced the number of Uromastic species that I keep, because, as you so eloquently mentioned, there's only so much time and space you have. If you have one pair of 20 different species, you're not necessarily serving each species very well in terms of their longevity and presence in herpetoculture. You'd be better served having 20 pairs of two species. I mean, it's just you're going to there's more to be gained. There's so much to unravel in an individual species when you work with them in sufficient number for sufficient lengths of time. And as I'm sure too, sometimes there are problems and challenges that you can come up against that only happen when you've been breeding or keeping something for so many years. I mean, we think about the first 5 years of keeping something as like, well, that's when you really like dial it in. And it's like, okay, but 5 years of keeping something is not the same as 25. And breeding something once is not the same as breeding something for 5 straight generations in your facility. It's like it is an absolute completely different beast, you know? And it's, I don't know. It's something that I just wish I saw a little more. It seems like such a small number of people really dedicate themselves to one kind of animal for an extended period of time.
Yeah. No, I guess you're talking about a learning curve for sure with, 5 years versus 25. But yeah, I mean, a example of that, I had never seen Acanthurus come out with their tail out of a burrow and prod around, showing that they've got sensitivity on the end of their tail. And I worked with the species for like 10 years. So it's backing out of a cork tube and starts prodding around. Is it safe out there? Like it was a big, long, finger poking and prodding around. And I wonder how many, Ackie keepers have even witnessed that, but it seemed like it was 8 or 10 years of working with the species before I even witnessed that behavior.
Wow. So that's super cool.
Seems like
yeah,
for sure.
That's amazing. Wow. I've never heard of that. That sounds super cool. Okay. So,
well, cool, man. Yeah. So you got another one?
Into the last one. It's the last one. I
don't want to bore any.
No. It's
right. I don't want to bore anybody out there. I feel like I'm mega rambling over here.
No. Actually, it's part of what we like out of the show is I don't think, because one of the things I think we do differently on the podcast is we're just having these conversations. There's not necessarily a cap on them. Sometimes they're a little shorter, sometimes they're a little longer, and it just depends on what we're talking about. And I think it's a great thing. I love these long form conversations. But this will be the last question, so that way you can get on. I know you're you're a busy man, so. So the last question is
way past my bedtime over here.
Yeah, right. Exactly. So the last question is why herpetoculture? And that could be like not just why do you do it? It's kind of intended as like why do we do it? What do you think the value is that it gives us, and or you can interpret it however you want. Like Phil Tremper said, it's a disease. We've had that's my favorite answer, but we've had all kinds of different responses to this. So I'm curious what yours is.
Well, I guess I've never had this question asked of me before, but I think of it's kind of our connection to nature and the wild, and I think you talk about health, being in nature and being in the wild to me is an extremely healthy thing. I mean, I'm a grounding dork, so I walk out on the bare earth, with my feet to connect with the earth and walk the dogs, every single morning, but I think that even if people stay inside 24 hours a day, it's a connection to nature. And if we didn't have it in our home, or if we couldn't at least see it on TV or visit in a zoo, how could you care what's going on, out there in nature? And so I think it's a great way to connect. And the learning lessons are endless for us as adults and our kids as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely, man. That's a great answer. I really like that quite a bit. Well, so Brandon, listen, thank you. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me and have this conversation. I think if I recall correctly, you said you haven't done a podcast before this one. Is that right?
I haven't, so hopefully I did all right. And then hopefully I don't get harassed by the other people that have asked me. And I apologize for that. I've had some great phone conversations with you. And so when you asked, it seemed like appropriate timing to finally say yes. So I apologize for the other people that I didn't know quite as well that I said no to.
Well, yeah, and if anybody asks, you can just say I twisted your arm. They were like, hey, he just, he tried to put me in the bar. I had to listen. But no, genuinely, I really appreciate it, man, because I really admire what you're doing. I really appreciate and respect the mindset that you have for the way you do things at Rare Earth. And so just thank you. I appreciate you sharing the time, and hopefully we can have another conversation and have Roy next time, because I'm sure he'll have other questions that I didn't even think of that would be extra interesting for you.
All right. Well, I was very comfortable with this one, so hopefully Roy wouldn't totally put me in the hot seat or something if he gets on here.
Nah, man, you saw that image, that profile picture of him when I turned the camera off. He's just a quiet farmer. It's all good.
I'll wear my hat then, so we can be twinners.
Oh yeah, that's awesome. That is awesome. Okay, great. Well, Brandon, thanks again, man. And that's about it. I'm just gonna hit the stop the record button. Let me see.